Hello everyone, this is Azim Hasni, and in today's episode we are building an IoC container using PHP. In case you're not familiar with the term IoC container, it's basically a class that acts as a container and holds instances of other classes and their dependencies. In some implementations, or especially the implementation that we will be building today, the container has the ability to automatically resolve the dependencies of a class when building the instances. I hope that made some sense. Let's start coding and see how all of that works in code. So to build an IoC container in PHP, we will need obviously a class. We will name it container because that's the name of our file, and I will list down all of the methods that we will need for this class, and then we will implement all of them one by one. So the first method that we will need is bind, and this will accept two parameters. The first one, we're going to call it abstract, and the other is going to be concrete. So the idea is you can give an interface. You can pass to this method, you can pass an interface or an abstract class, and then the second parameter is going to be an instance of a class that implements or extends that abstract class or the interface. And then we store that information in the container. As I told you in the introduction, it's basically you can think of this class, this container class, as an array that holds a list of classes but has some behavior in it and can help you building class instances and resolving dependencies. The second method that we will need on this class is, we're going to name it resolve, and that method is going to accept only one parameter, and that parameter is named abstract, but you can name it anything. So the job of the resolve method is to build the instance of whatever class is currently being processed. And while doing that, it's also going to resolve all of the dependencies and the dependencies of the dependencies, if that makes sense. So that's what this resolve method is going to do, and it will eventually either throw an exception if it can't decide what to return, or return an instance of a class that was meant to be instantiated by the container. And the third method, or the rest of the methods, are actually helper methods for the resolve method, so I'm gonna keep them as protected. So this method is, we're gonna name it ensure class is instantiable, and what I'm typing wrong, and the third method is also helper method for the resolve, so I'm gonna make that protected as well. So that's called build instance, and it will take a class name and build an instance of that class. So let's start implementing from the bind method. So we'll say, I think for the bind method we actually need an array property on the container, so I'm gonna call it protected bindings and I'm gonna bindings, and I'm gonna push the value of the concrete parameter to the bindings array and use the value of the abstract parameter as the key. So that we have it stored somewhere that we can look it up later using the same key. That's it for the bind method. So let's move on to the resolve method. So let's see what we need to do to implement the resolve method. So the things that we need to do here is we need to make sure that the abstract or whatever value the abstract parameter holds is actually exists in the bindings array. If it doesn't, that means this can be a class that is not registered with the container yet. So we need to make sure that this abstract itself is actually instantiable. That means it's not an abstract, that means it's a concrete class then. And the second thing is, let's do that first. So I'm going to say if not set this bindings abstract. If that's not the case, then we need to call this helper method. This is going to ensure that if this is not registered with us, then this must be instantiable. Otherwise, we will throw an exception. So I'm going to just call this ensure class is instantiable. Actually, I forgot to add a parameter here, so I'm going to call it class. And then I'm going to pass the abstract to it. So this will make sure that whatever value this abstract variable holds is actually instantiable. If it's not, then it's going to throw an exception from here. Okay, we'll take a look at that in a bit. So after that, I'm going to create a variable and call it concrete. And then I'm going to say this bindings. This bindings abstract. If we don't have it in that list, then we're gonna assume we need to resolve the value of the abstract. So we're gonna store that as concrete. Another thing that we need to support is the concrete can also be callable. It can be a function as well. So we need to check that if is callable concrete. If it is, then we will just return call user func concrete. So this will help us create instances of classes that can't be automatically created. So we'll see that when we look at examples of using this container later in the episode, but for now keep that in mind. And then if it's not a callback, then we will just return this build instance and then pass the concrete to it. Okay, so this is the method that we are calling here. So that's it for the resolve method. Now move on to the ensure class is instantiable. So this is going to be pretty simple, and we'll just create a reflection of that class. So I'm going to say new reflection class and pass the class to it, class variable to it, and then we'll say if not reflection is instantiable, then we'll throw an exception and we say, so I'm going to say class is not instantiable. And that's it for this method. I'm going to close it and move on to the next method. So from this method, we will be using the reflection API, same as we did in this ensure class is instantiable method. So I'm going to create a variable called reflection and that is going to be a class reflection, and I'm going to pass the class variable to it, and then I'm going to get the constructor of that class using the reflections API. So reflection get constructor. We're getting the constructor so that we know what parameters that class needs and what are the types of those parameters, so that we can also build instances of those parameters. And if the parameters also have dependencies, then we are going to do that recursively for all of them. And we'll say if set this bindings class and is callable this bindings class, then I'll say return call user func and pass this bindings class to it. And after that, I'm gonna say if there is no constructor, so I'm gonna say if not constructor, and the class itself that was passed, like this one, is instantiable, then we'll just build an instance of it, new class. Okay, we're doing this because if the class has no constructor and it is instantiable, which means it's not an interface or an abstract class, then we can just build an instance of it. That means it has no dependencies that we need to resolve. So moving on to the next pieces, and we'll say if not constructor and is set this bindings class. In this case, we'll say class is equal to this bindings class and return this build instance class. What we're doing here is if there is no constructor but we have a value stored for that key or the abstract that was passed to this build instance method, that means this class variable can hold an interface or an abstract class. So that means we need to build it. We don't need to build an instance of that, but we need to actually build an instance of whatever we have stored with us, and we will pass that to this method so that it has all of the checks that we have here for that value that we have stored. Now moving on to the next piece, so I'll say if not constructor and not is set this bindings class, then we'll just throw an exception. Oops. Exception class is not instantiable. Okay, so that means if there is no constructor, the class has no constructor, and we also don't have the concrete binding for that class, then we will just throw an exception because we can't build an instance of an interface or an abstract class. If it's not an interface, then we won't reach this point. We will make an instance and return it from this line. So far we have only covered here, we have only covered a class that has no constructor. That means there are no parameters to resolve. So we also need to build instances of a class that has a constructor, and that constructor also accepts parameters. So I'm gonna store the parameters in a variable, all of the parameters that the constructor of this class is expecting. So I'm gonna say constructor get parameters, and then I'm gonna also create another variable so that we can store the instances of parameters in somewhere. So I'm gonna create parameter instances, and it's gonna be an empty array for now. Now we need to loop through all of the parameters, and we will build instances of each parameter. So what I'm going to do here is make sure that we know the type of the parameter, and if there are non-optional parameters that we don't know the type, then that means we can't build this instance and we'll throw an exception. So I'm gonna check that by saying if parameter get type, if we don't know the type, that means it's just a variable, it's not type hinted, then we'll check if it's not optional, which means it's required. So is optional, and then in that case we will throw an exception, and in the message we will say parameter get name for class is not instantiable. And after that, if we have our sanity check here, after that we're gonna say parameter instances, and we will push this build instance parameter get class get name, get the class name from the type of the parameter that you have type hinted. So once we have resolved all of the parameters, and so we're doing that recursively, remember that. So it's gonna do it for all of the parameters and their dependencies as well. So after that we are going to just create an instance. Now that we have the parameters, we are going to create an instance of this class, and we will pass all of the parameter instances to the class. Okay, and I think that's it, but there is one more thing. Since this is a container and it's going to be shared between all of the components of our application, we need to make sure that there is always only one instance of this class. So we are going to use the Singleton design pattern and make sure that there is always one instance of this class. So I'm gonna first of all make the constructor of this class protected so that nobody can just create an instance of it underscore construct. So I'm gonna make that protected, and that means if it's protected, that means only this class and classes that extend the container will be able to create an instance of this. So we need one static method. I'm going to call it get instance, and it will check if not is null. We will need to create one static property on this class as well. So I'm gonna call it protected static instance is equal to null, so it will be null by default, and we will add the type, also make it nullable, and we'll say if self instance, if it's not null, sorry, if it is null, then we will say self instance is equal to new static. Otherwise we will just return whatever value that instance variable holds, which is going to be the instance of this class. So now let's see how we're gonna use our IoC container. I think I have covered all of the methods, so if everything is all right, we should be able to use it. I have another file here called index.php, and that file requires the container class here. So to test our IoC container, I'm gonna create a couple of interfaces, and so let's use our database drivers as an example. So I'll have an interface called database driver, and that interface is going to have two methods. One is going to be connect, and the other is going to be query. And we will make two classes that implement this database driver, and I'm gonna create a class called MySQL or MySQL, and that will implement the database driver interface. I'm gonna add the method stubs, and I will just add var dumps here, connecting to MySQL, and then querying MySQL database. And I'm going to just copy this, paste it here, and then rename it to Postgres. So I'm going to create a PostgreSQL implementation as well, and change this to PGSQL. Okay, now we have a couple of classes and an interface to test our container. I'm gonna say app is equal to container get instance, and I'll say app bind the database driver to our MySQL or MySQL implementation. And then I'll create another class here as well, so that we can use the database driver as a dependency. So I'm gonna create another class here. I'm gonna call it user model, and in the constructor I'm gonna say database driver, and let's say driver, and then I'll say driver connect and driver query. Okay, and I will need to resolve or create an instance of the user model using our container. So I'm gonna say app resolve user model class, and if everything is written correctly, then we should see connecting to MySQL and querying MySQL database. So let's open up our terminal. I'm gonna run the index.php here. Cool, so we're seeing what we were expecting, but now let's change the implementation of the database driver to PostgreSQL and then run it again. So now we are seeing PGSQL here. And there's one more use case that I want to test as well. If you take a look here, we can also pass a callback to the bind method, and it will be stored and called when needed in the resolve method. So I'm going to test that as well. So to test that, I'm going to create a class and I'll call it Facebook login, and in the constructor of this class we need an API key and an API secret. So these are parameters that the IoC container can't actually resolve because it has no clue what type of this API key parameter is or the API secret is. Even if we add the type like a string, it won't know what the value should be. So let's var dump here. FB login module is ready. Okay, and I'm going to bind that app bind. I'm basically registering the Facebook login class to the container. So I'm gonna say Facebook login class, and then a callback. From this callback we will return an instance of that Facebook login, but here we can actually pass our secrets. Okay, so in the user model, if we type hint, suppose we need the Facebook login here as well. So now the IoC container knows what an instance of this Facebook login is, and it can pass it to our user model. Let's run it and we should see the Facebook login module is ready. Yeah, so you see it here. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below and I'll try my best to respond.